Charles collapses in private. Guard claims Camilla's reaction left the palace horrified. From the moment the sun rose over the palace grounds, the day seemed as ordinary as any other in the royal household. The sky was soft and pale, the kind of morning that usually brought a calm, peaceful rhythm to everyone inside the historic walls. The staff moved quietly through the corridors, carrying out tasks they knew by heart. Everything followed familiar patterns, and nothing appeared unusual at first glance. But beneath the smooth surface of routine, something felt slightly off, even if no one could put it into words yet. Charles began his morning with the calm dignity people expected of him. For decades, he had learned how to carry responsibility with steady hands and a patient smile. He had perfected the art of moving through his schedule as though time itself bowed respectfully to his presence. Yet the last few weeks had been heavier than most. There had been an unspoken weariness in the way he walked, a faint weakness in the way he lifted documents during briefings, and a slight tremble in moments when he thought no one was watching. He never mentioned these things to anyone. That was not his way. He preferred silence over complaint, composure over worry. But those who had served him long enough understood the subtle signs that something inside him was shifting. A palace guard named Thomas noticed it first. Thomas had been assigned to the king's detail for years and had learned to read Charles's moods through the smallest details. The pace of his footsteps, the tone of his voice, and the way he held himself while walking from room to room. Thomas had often admired the king's self-control, yet lately he sensed a tiredness that did not belong to the man he knew. Still, Thomas said nothing. In the palace, things were not spoken unless there was clear reason. The staff understood boundaries, and they respected them with great care. Charles entered the breakfast room a little later than usual. His steps were slower than they had been a month ago, but he kept his expression composed. A few advisors noticed, exchanging short glances but not daring to comment. Charles greeted each person politely, though his voice lacked its usual warmth. As he sat down, he took a quiet breath, steadying himself before beginning his day. He tasted his tea, but the flavor felt distant. He listened to the morning briefings, but the words seemed to float around him instead of sinking in. He nodded politely. He even managed a small smile. But inside, there was a heaviness he could not shake, a weight that pressed gently yet persistently against his energy. Throughout the morning, he completed meetings, signed papers, and held conversations with advisors. He did everything expected of him, but his body gave small reminders that things were not quite right. A slight dizziness would come and go like a passing breeze. His vision blurred for a brief second during one of the briefings. Once he held onto the back of a chair a moment longer than necessary to steady himself. No one dared mention it aloud, yet nearly everyone noticed. The palace was a place where feelings ran deep, but words were chosen carefully. People saw, but they rarely spoke unless the situation demanded it. Even so, whispers began to move between staff members in hushed tones. "Has he been resting enough?" These murmurs floated quietly through back corridors where only the staff walked, never near the king himself. Camilla, meanwhile, was in another wing of the palace preparing for her own engagements. Her schedule was full, and she approached it with her usual focus. She had meetings, event planning, and documents to review. She moved briskly from room to room, unaware of the concern slowly gathering around Charles. To her, it was just another day filled with tasks and responsibilities that demanded both attention and precision. Throughout the morning, Charles kept moving, though each hour seemed to stretch longer than normal. By midday, he appeared more tired than he intended to show. While walking to his private study, he paused in the hallway for a moment, placing a gentle hand on the wall for balance. Thomas, who followed at a respectful distance, noticed. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked softly. Charles straightened slightly, turning enough to offer a faint smile. "Yes, yes, just a moment of lightheadedness," he replied. "Nothing to worry about." He resumed walking before Thomas could say anything further, but Thomas's concern did not fade. He had known the king long enough to understand when something said was not entirely true. Charles was not the type to admit discomfort unless it was impossible to hide. And right now, he was still trying to hide it. Inside the private study, sunlight drifted through tall windows, spreading a soft warmth across the room. The desk was neatly arranged, papers placed in tidy stacks, and a half-finished letter lay open where Charles had left it earlier. He took a slow, careful breath and sat down. The cushion beneath him seemed unusually soft today, almost pulling him downward with a quiet invitation to rest. He rubbed his temples gently, trying to dispel the lingering sense of exhaustion. It was unusual for him to feel this tired so early in the day. Yet he pushed the thought away, reminding himself of the long list of duties waiting for him. There was always something to sign, approve, read, or respond to. The demands never truly ended, and he had dedicated his life to meeting them with steady resolve. But today, even he could not ignore the heaviness that seemed to anchor itself inside him. Outside the study door, Thomas took his position, standing tall and silent as always. His training told him to remain calm, but his instincts whispered that something was wrong. He listened for any unusual sounds inside the room, but for several minutes, everything was quiet. Elsewhere in the palace, Camilla continued with her responsibilities, unaware that her husband had retreated into quiet exhaustion. She moved through rooms filled with assistants, advisors, and planners. Her focus was sharp, but her mind was busy, thinking about upcoming engagements, scheduling concerns, and the long list of events she needed to oversee. She expected to speak with Charles later, once both of their schedules allowed it, and she gave no thought to anything being amiss. Back in the study, Charles attempted to review a document, but the letters blurred slightly. He blinked a few times, trying to clear his vision. When that didn't help, he leaned back in his chair, breathing slowly. The day felt strangely heavy, like the air had thickened around him. He removed his glasses and set them on the desk, closing his eyes for a brief moment. Just a moment, he told himself. Only a moment of rest. The palace outside remained calm, unaware of the quiet struggle happening behind the closed study door. Staff passed through hallways, exchanging polite greetings, continuing with their work. But occasionally, someone would glance toward the wing Charles occupied, as though sensing a shift in the air, a subtle hint that something important was happening out of sight. The afternoon sun continued to warm the palace walls, even as Charles sat in silence, his energy slipping little by little. He tried to reassure himself that he only needed rest, only a small pause. This was not serious, he insisted inwardly. It was just fatigue. But deep down, even he felt a faint unease rising within him. He opened his eyes again, trying to refocus on the document in front of him, but the effort felt heavier than it should have. He reached for a pen but paused halfway, feeling a strange wave of dizziness wash over him. He placed the pen down slowly, steadying himself with one hand on the arm of the chair. Outside the door, Thomas shifted slightly, not out of discomfort but out of instinct. He sensed something, though he could not explain how. Years of service had taught him to trust his intuition, especially when it concerned the king. Inside the study, Charles closed his eyes once more. His breathing, though controlled, grew shallower. He leaned forward, intending to stand, but paused, unsure if he had enough strength. He took another slow breath. An ordinary day, he reminded himself, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. The palace hallway grew quiet as the afternoon settled in. The light outside had softened into a warm glow that gently touched the windows. Everything inside the building moved in a comfortable rhythm, just as it had every day before. Staff members crossed paths respectfully, carrying out their duties with calm professionalism. To anyone passing through, the atmosphere would have seemed perfectly normal, even peaceful. But behind one particular door, something unexpected was just moments away from happening. Thomas, the guard stationed outside the king's private study, stood attentively as he always did. His eyes scanned the corridor casually, returning again and again to the door he was protecting. For years, he had guarded important rooms and had seen countless days pass in the same quiet way. Yet today, there was a faint feeling in his chest he couldn't ignore. It was not fear exactly, nor alarm. It was more like a whisper inside him telling him to be alert, to pay closer attention. He did not know why the feeling had come over him, but he trusted his instincts. They had rarely failed him. Inside the study, Charles sat alone. The silence around him felt heavier than before. His breathing was steady but slightly strained, as though each inhale took more effort than it should have. He tried to keep his posture straight, though his body felt unusually tired. A simple movement like lifting his hand or straightening his back required deeper concentration. He blinked slowly, trying to clear his vision, but the room still seemed to tilt gently, as if the ground beneath him was moving. He leaned back in his chair, hoping the dizziness would pass. It had happened earlier in the morning, but only briefly. Now it lingered longer, refusing to fade. He took another slow breath, wishing the strange heaviness in his chest would settle. He told himself that he simply needed rest, nothing more. Yet a small, unsettling thought pressed against the back of his mind. He chose to ignore it for now. Thomas remained at his post, hands folded behind him. From time to time, he listened for sounds from inside the room. Usually, the king would turn a page, move his chair slightly, or walk to the window. Today, however, everything was still. Too still. Thomas frowned gently, though he kept his posture controlled. He did not want to seem tense, but the unusual quietness made him uneasy. Minutes passed with no sound at all. Inside the study, Charles attempted to rise from his chair. He wanted to stretch his legs, to breathe some fresh air from the balcony just a few steps away. But when he pressed his hands against the sides of the chair to push himself up, his arms felt strangely weak. A wave of exhaustion rolled through him, almost stopping him in place. He paused, waiting for it to pass. The room blurred again for a split second. He sat back down slowly, allowing himself a moment to gather strength. He closed his eyes and pressed 2 fingers gently to his forehead. He told himself it was just tiredness, perhaps the result of a long week. But even he could feel the truth pushing its way through his thoughts. Something was not right, and pretending otherwise would not change it. He opened his eyes again, trying once more to stand. This time he managed to lift himself halfway. But just as he began to straighten, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him more strongly than before. His balance slipped. His fingers brushed the edge of the desk, but not firmly enough to steady himself. A soft, surprising sound escaped his lips, more confusion than distress, as he felt his body lose strength. Then everything happened in an instant. His legs gave out beneath him, and he fell sideways, collapsing gently to the floor. The thud was not loud, but in the silence of the study it carried sharply. Thomas's head snapped toward the door. The sound was small, yet unmistakable. Years of training told him that something unexpected had occurred. He immediately stepped forward and knocked twice, firmly but respectfully. "Sir, are you all right?" he called through the wood. There was no answer. Thomas waited only 1 heartbeat before his instincts took over. He pushed the door open carefully but quickly, preparing for anything. His eyes scanned the room in a single sweep, and then they froze on the sight before him. Charles lay on the carpet beside the desk, his body resting sideways, one hand near the edge of the chair as though he had tried to catch himself. His eyes were partly closed, and he appeared conscious but dazed, struggling to gather his breath. His face showed confusion more than fear, as if his body had betrayed him without warning. Thomas rushed to his side immediately, kneeling beside him with controlled urgency. "Sir, can you hear me?" he asked gently, his voice calm despite the alarm rising inside him. Charles blinked once slowly. His breathing was shallow but steady. I'm all right," he whispered, though the weakness in his voice said otherwise. Thomas shook his head softly. "You're not all right, sir. I need to call for help." Without waiting for approval, Thomas pressed the small communication device attached to his uniform and quickly informed the medical team. His tone remained steady and professional, but inside, his heart was beating faster. He had never seen the king collapse before. He had seen him tired, stressed, even overwhelmed by long schedules, but never like this. As Thomas spoke, Charles closed his eyes again, trying to breathe through the dizzy fog clouding his mind. He felt embarrassed, even in this vulnerable state. He disliked causing worry or attention. He wanted to sit up on his own, to speak clearly, to reassure Thomas. But his body refused to cooperate. Within moments, footsteps echoed down the hallway as palace medical staff hurried toward the study. Their shoes tapped urgently against the polished floor, signaling that the situation had become serious. Thomas stayed close, speaking in a calm and steady voice to keep Charles aware. "You're going to be fine, sir. Help is coming. Just stay with me." Charles breathed gently, focusing on the sound of Thomas's voice. It helped guide him through the cloud-like heaviness surrounding his thoughts. The medical team entered the room quickly but quietly, carrying equipment and wearing expressions of calm concentration. They approached Charles with gentle care, asking him questions in soft voices. "Sir, can you tell us how you feel?" They moved around him with practiced precision, their hands working in smooth motions as they checked his pulse, his breathing, and his responsiveness. One of the medics looked at Thomas and gave a small nod of reassurance, not that everything was fine, but that they were in control of the situation. Thomas exhaled slowly, grateful for their presence, yet still deeply worried. Outside the room, word began to spread. Staff passing through the corridor noticed the unusual activity and exchanged nervous glances. Whispered questions floated behind half-closed doors. What happened? No one knew the full story yet, only that something serious was unfolding inside the king's study. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Camilla was finishing a discussion with her assistants. She did not notice anything unusual at first, not until one of her aides approached with a slightly pale expression. "Ma'am, you are needed in the king's study." Camilla paused mid-step, sensing the tension in the aide's voice. Something in her chest tightened as she walked toward the door. She did not know what she was about to find, but she knew it was urgent. Back in the study, Charles was slowly becoming more alert as the medical team worked around him. They lifted him gently, supporting him with practiced care. He still felt weak, but he could now feel a bit more strength returning to his hands and arms. Thomas stayed close by, quietly hopeful but attentive to every detail. He felt responsible, not because he caused anything, but because he was the one who had found Charles, the one who had acted in the first moments when it mattered most. Minutes later, the door opened again, and Camilla stepped inside. Her eyes widened as she saw Charles on the floor surrounded by medical staff. A flood of emotions swept through her: concern, confusion, and something deeper she could not yet name. The quiet room shifted again as her arrival added a new layer of tension, but that moment belongs to the next part of the story. Camilla stood frozen for a moment at the doorway, her eyes fixed on Charles, who was sitting on the floor supported by two medical staff members. For the first few seconds, her mind seemed unable to process what she was seeing. The room, normally calm and filled with gentle warmth, now felt strangely cold and tense. The air felt heavy, pressing down on everyone present. When she finally stepped inside, her movements were quick but uncertain, like someone trying to walk through fog. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked at her husband. She had seen him tired, stressed, or worried many times before, but she had never seen him like this, weak, pale, and unable to rise on his own. She hurried forward, but as soon as she reached the center of the room, her emotions overwhelmed her. A mix of fear, confusion, and shock built inside her so quickly that she did not know how to control it. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "What happened? Why is he on the floor? Why wasn't I told at once?" Her words cut through the air, and the staff members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Thomas straightened instinctively, though he remained calm. The medical team continued working, not allowing the tension to disrupt their focus. Camilla looked around the room, her eyes moving from person to person as if searching for someone to blame for what she was witnessing. But it wasn't anger she truly felt. It was fear, a deep, sudden fear that made her heart race faster than she could manage. She cared for Charles deeply, and seeing him in such a vulnerable state shook her more than she could admit. One of the medics spoke gently, trying to ease the rising tension. "Ma'am, we responded as quickly as possible. He experienced sudden weakness and lost his balance. We're doing everything we can to help him." Camilla nodded, though her breaths were uneven. She held her hands together tightly to stop them from shaking. She looked at Charles again, and her expression softened briefly. For a moment, her eyes filled with worry, but she blinked quickly, trying to hold herself together. "Charles, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice quieter now but still unsteady. Charles opened his eyes slowly and offered a faint, reassuring smile, though it lacked strength. "I'm all right," he murmured, though the words were barely above a whisper. But he didn't look all right, and everyone in the room knew it. His face held a tiredness that went far beyond a long day. His breathing was slow, and his body felt heavy in the arms of the medical staff. He looked as though he wanted to stand or speak more clearly, but his body refused to cooperate. Camilla took another slow step forward, her emotions twisting inside her. She didn't mean to sound harsh earlier. She didn't want anyone to misunderstand her reaction. It was simply that the sight of Charles like this had shaken her deeply, leaving her unsure how to respond. Still, her voice rose again, sharper than she intended. "Why wasn't someone with him? How did this happen without anyone noticing sooner?" Thomas lowered his gaze respectfully before answering in a steady voice. "I was stationed outside, ma'am. When I heard a sound, I entered immediately and called for help at once." Camilla stared at him for a second, her face tight with worry, then exhaled shakily. I understand, she said finally, though the tension in her shoulders did not disappear. She wasn't truly upset with Thomas. She was upset at the situation, at the fear she felt inside her chest, fear she didn't know how to express gently. The medical team continued their careful work, checking Charles's pulse again, assessing his breathing, and encouraging him to stay awake and responsive. They spoke to him softly, asking simple questions to keep him focused. "Sir, are you feeling any discomfort?" He seemed embarrassed to be surrounded by so many people while feeling so weak. His instinct was always to appear strong and composed, especially in front of Camilla. But today, his strength had failed him without warning. As Camilla watched the medical staff, her expression shifted repeatedly, from worry to confusion to frustration, then back to worry again. She couldn't calm herself enough to stand still. She moved to the window, then stepped back to Charles's side, then crossed the room again. Her thoughts raced faster than she could manage. To the staff, her behavior seemed unpredictable, not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much and did not know how to steady her emotions. A palace worker standing near the door whispered quietly to another, "She must be terrified. She's not herself right now." The other nodded, "I've never seen her react like this." Their voices were soft, but the sense of unease in the room grew. People were not used to seeing Camilla unsettled. They were not used to seeing Charles so weak. And they were certainly not used to seeing a moment like this unfold in the private halls of the palace. The medical team finally placed a soft cushion behind Charles to support him better as he sat upright. They encouraged him to take slow breaths, and his breathing gradually began to deepen. His color improved slightly, though he still appeared drained. Camilla crouched beside him, her movements finally gentler. She took his hand carefully, holding it as though it were something fragile. Her voice softened. "I was so worried," she whispered. "You scared everyone." Charles gave a tiny nod, his eyes fluttering closed, then open again. "I didn't mean to," he said faintly. His soft tone made Camilla's breath catch again, but she held her composure this time. She didn't want to upset him with her fear. She wanted him to feel safe, supported, and cared for. But the room still carried the echo of her earlier reactions that had surprised even her. Thomas stepped back to give them space, but his eyes remained watchful. He wanted to be sure the king stayed conscious and responsive. His sense of duty felt even stronger now. The doctors began preparing to move Charles to another room where they could examine him more thoroughly. They spoke to him gently, explaining each step. "Sir, we will help you stand soon." Charles listened and nodded weakly. Camilla stood up quickly when she heard they planned to move him. "Are you sure he can stand?" she asked anxiously. "Shouldn't you bring something for him to lie on instead?" Her concerns were understandable, but her worried tone made her sound almost impatient. One of the medics gave her a polite nod. "We will be very careful, ma'am. We won't let him fall or strain himself." Camilla pressed her lips together, clearly still uneasy, but she stepped aside. Every pair of eyes in the room followed her not out of judgment, but out of surprise. Her emotions, usually kept in check, now seemed to shift from one second to the next. The tension made the room feel heavier. When the medical staff finally helped Charles stand, Thomas instinctively stepped forward to support them. Camilla hovered nearby, unable to step away completely, yet afraid she might get in the way. Charles wobbled slightly as he rose. Thomas steadied him, and Charles gave a grateful nod, though he still looked tired. The staff moved slowly, guiding him toward the hallway. Camilla followed closely, her hands clasped together tightly. Her face held a pale worry that had stunned several people in the room earlier. As they exited the study, a wave of silence swept through the corridor. Staff members stepped aside respectfully, watching the scene with wide eyes. They had heard whispers of the collapse, but seeing the king being helped through the hallway made the situation feel suddenly real. Camilla's troubled expression did not go unnoticed. Her worry-filled eyes, her tense shoulders, and her earlier emotional outbursts created an atmosphere that left many in quiet shock. The guard who had first called for help would later describe her reaction as something he had never witnessed from her before, raw, overwhelmed, and unexpectedly shaken. But no one judged her. They only felt the weight of the moment. Charles, guided by the medics, moved slowly toward the room prepared for his examination. Camilla followed closely behind, her worry clear in every step she took. The palace watched in silence, wondering what the rest of the day would bring. The hallway outside the study felt strangely silent after Charles was moved from the room. Even though people continued their work, the air carried a sense of worry that no one could ignore. Staff walked more quietly than usual, speaking in soft whispers, as though afraid that their voices might disturb the delicate atmosphere surrounding the palace. Everyone had seen the king being supported by the medical team, and the image stayed in their minds long after he disappeared into the next room. Inside the examination room, the medics guided Charles to a comfortable chair with slow, careful movements. He leaned back as they adjusted the position to support him better. His breathing had steadied, but the weakness in his body remained noticeable. He looked tired in a way that made people want to offer comfort rather than questions. Camilla stayed at his side, though she moved with uncertainty. She wanted to help, but every time she tried to speak, her voice sounded unsteady. Her emotions were still tangled from the shock earlier. She watched the medical team as they checked Charles again, and every small action they took seemed to add another layer to her worry. One of the medics held a clipboard and began noting details, while another gently placed a monitor on Charles's arm. The room filled with soft beeping sounds as the machines began their work. The steady rhythm provided some reassurance, but Camilla still clasped her hands tightly together. Every time Charles closed his eyes for a few seconds, she held her breath, waiting for them to open again. In the corner of the room, Thomas remained standing, his posture disciplined yet caring. He had been asked to stay nearby in case anything else was needed. Though he tried to remain neutral, he could not hide the concern in his eyes. He had served Charles for many years and regarded him with deep respect. Seeing him so vulnerable left a quiet ache inside him. As the medical team continued their assessment, one of the advisors who had been informed earlier entered the room slowly. He wore an expression of controlled calm, but his eyes revealed the weight of responsibility he carried. He approached Camilla carefully, aware that she was still shaken. "Ma'am," he said softly, "we've increased privacy in this wing. Only essential staff will be allowed in or near this area." Camilla nodded absently, her focus still on Charles. "Thank you," she replied, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. The advisor stepped back, sensing she needed space. The room remained tense in a quiet, heavy way. Every small movement felt meaningful. Every silence seemed to stretch longer than expected. Outside the room, palace workers exchanged quiet conversations, wondering what the king's condition might be. They did not gossip loudly, that would have been inappropriate, but they shared their concerns in gentle voices. "Do you think he'll be all right?" The palace was a place where people cared deeply for those they served, even if they didn't always show it openly. Inside the room, the medical team finished their initial checks. One of them stepped forward to report their findings to Camilla, speaking gently and carefully. She listened with deep concentration, though at times her eyes flickered back toward Charles, unable to stay still for long. "We will continue to monitor him closely," the medic explained. "He needs rest and observation. It's important that he avoids stress for now." Camilla nodded, though her eyes reflected a deeper concern. "We'll make sure of that," she said quietly, but the atmosphere still felt tense. Not because anyone was misbehaving, but because emotions were high and the situation had shaken everyone more than expected. Camilla moved a little closer to Charles, sitting down beside him. She reached for his hand again, though her fingers trembled slightly. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them was not cold. It was filled with unspoken fear, unspoken hope, and unspoken questions. Charles slowly turned his head toward her, offering a faint, tired smile. It was small, but it held warmth. Camilla's eyes softened the moment she saw it. "Don't frighten us like that again," she whispered, trying to make her voice sound steady. His smile widened just a little, though still weak. "I'll try not to," he murmured. Hearing him speak eased some of the heaviness inside her, but only slightly. She still felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. She had never imagined such a day when she would walk into a room and find Charles unable to stand on his own. The medical team continued adjusting equipment, checking numbers, and preparing to examine him further. Though they worked quietly, the seriousness of their expressions did not go unnoticed. Every staff member in the palace who had heard about the collapse began feeling an anxious tension spreading through the air. In the main corridors, senior advisors gathered in small groups, discussing how to manage the internal situation. They needed to ensure privacy, calm the staff, and avoid unnecessary rumors. Most importantly, they had to respect the king's condition while making sure nothing about the incident spread beyond the palace walls. One advisor shook his head slowly. "People are already talking," he whispered to another. "They saw the queen's reaction. They've never seen her so distressed." Another nodded. "It truly surprised them. They didn't expect that from her." It wasn't spoken with disrespect, only with quiet surprise. Camilla had always been composed, especially in public. To see her unsettled, pacing, raising her voice, and struggling to contain her emotions was something few had ever witnessed. It had left an impression that staff members found difficult to forget. Inside the examination room, Charles tried to speak again, though his voice was faint. "I must have worried you," he said softly. Camilla swallowed hard, her eyes glimmering with emotion she tried to hide. "You did," she answered honestly. "But the important thing is that you're here and you're being looked after." One of the medics approached and began gently guiding Charles to a more comfortable resting position. He obeyed without protest, though he seemed embarrassed by the attention. Camilla observed every movement closely, still tense, still unsure how to calm herself completely. Some palace workers later described how the atmosphere shifted when Camilla spoke too abruptly earlier. They had not meant any harm by their comments, but the memory stayed with them, the sharpness in her tone, the hurried steps, the frantic questions. It was all so unlike her usual calm self that it left people unsettled long after she left the study. As time passed, the palace's private wing became quieter. Staff members walked with softer steps, and conversations grew even gentler. The sense of respect and caution filled every corner of the building. Even the sound of the wind outside seemed calmer, as though the world itself understood that something delicate was happening within those walls. The medical team eventually confirmed that Charles could rest in a nearby recovery room where he would be more comfortable. They carefully prepared to move him again, speaking kindly as they explained each step. Camilla watched closely, ready to help, but unsure whether she should step forward or stay back. "Please let us guide him," one medic said gently. "We'll take very good care of him." Camilla nodded again, though the worry in her eyes deepened. She wanted to be by Charles's side in every moment, but she also knew she needed to trust the people trained to help him. Thomas positioned himself near the door, ready to escort them. His protective instincts were stronger than ever. He had already witnessed more emotion in a single afternoon than he had seen in years of palace service. When the medics finally began moving Charles, everyone in the room adjusted to give space. Camilla walked behind them, her steps slow but steady. She watched every movement carefully. Her earlier reactions lingered in her mind, and she quietly wished she could rewind time and handle her emotions better. But moments of fear could pull feelings out of people in unexpected ways, and she knew this. As they stepped into the hallway, silence followed them again. Staff members who had been waiting nearby straightened immediately, their faces filled with concern but also respect. Nobody asked questions. Nobody made noise. They simply watched with hope that the king would recover quickly. Camilla's expression remained tense, though she tried to hide it. The advisor walking behind her noticed and quietly signaled for staff to give plenty of space. Once they reached the recovery room, the medics made sure Charles was settled comfortably. They arranged blankets, adjusted the lighting, and encouraged him to rest. Camilla stood nearby, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze fixed on him. Slowly, the room began to empty as non-essential staff stepped outside, leaving only those needed for his care. But even as they left, the feeling of shock from earlier remained in their minds. The guard who had first discovered Charles would later tell someone quietly that he had never seen such a strong emotional reaction from the Queen before, not one wrapped in anger, but in overwhelming fear. It was a moment that would stay with everyone who witnessed it, not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed how deeply she cared, even when her emotions escaped her control. Charles rested with closed eyes, breathing slowly, while Camilla stayed beside him, silently hoping that the day would end with peace and that tomorrow would bring better strength. The palace remained quiet, waiting, watching, and hoping, unsure what the next hours would bring. The palace felt unusually quiet the next morning, as though the walls themselves were still holding their breath from the events of the previous day. The early sun rose gently over the gardens, filling the windows with soft gold light, yet even the brightness did little to lift the heavy mood inside. Every hallway seemed calmer than usual, every footstep softer, every voice lower. The memory of Charles's collapse still lingered, shaping the behavior of everyone who walked through the palace. In the recovery room, the curtains were partly drawn to let in the warm morning glow. Charles lay in the bed prepared for him, and the light touched his face in a calming way. His breathing was steadier now, and though the weakness had not completely faded, he looked more peaceful than he had the day before. His hands rested gently on the blanket, and his expression was relaxed, as though he had finally allowed his body to rest the way it needed. Camilla sat nearby in a cushioned chair, watching him closely. She had barely slept during the night, unable to shake the worry that had settled deep inside her. Her thoughts kept returning to the moment when she had seen him on the floor, the shock, the fear, the feeling that time had stopped. She had replayed that scene 100 times in her mind, wishing she had reacted with more calmness, more composure. But emotions, especially the deepest ones, rarely behaved the way people wanted them to. She folded her hands in her lap, trying to steady her thoughts. Every now and then she glanced at the door, checking if the medical team was coming back. They had assured her Charles was improving, but she could not fully let go of her concern until she saw it with her own eyes. As the minutes passed, Charles slowly opened his eyes. He blinked at the soft light, then turned his head slightly toward Camilla. She leaned forward instantly, her face filled with gentle relief. "You're awake," she said, trying not to sound overly emotional. "How do you feel?" Charles offered her a small smile. It was faint but full of warmth. "Better than yesterday," he replied softly. Camilla exhaled quietly, the tension in her shoulders easing a little. "That is good," she whispered. "You had everyone worried." Charles nodded, aware of the effect his collapse had caused. He remembered the dizziness, the weakness, and the moment when his body simply stopped cooperating. But even more clearly, he remembered the expression on Camilla's face when she entered the study. That memory had stayed with him, her worry, her confusion, and the way her emotions had spilled out in a way he rarely saw. "You were frightened," he said gently, his gaze soft. Camilla looked down at her hands for a moment before answering. "Of course I was. I walked in and saw you on the floor. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know if you were going to be all right." Her voice wavered slightly, but she steadied it. "I reacted poorly. I let my fear take over." Charles shook his head slowly. "You reacted because you care," he said. "There is nothing wrong with that." His words settled between them like a warm blanket. Camilla looked up, meeting his eyes, and for the first time since yesterday, she felt her breath deepen with a sense of calm. A soft knock on the door interrupted the moment. The medical team entered quietly, careful not to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. They smiled politely at Charles. "Good morning, sir," one of them said warmly. "How are you feeling today?" Charles answered honestly. "Still a bit tired, but stronger than yesterday." "That is expected," the medic replied with a nod. "Your body needed rest, and it is responding well. You'll need to continue resting today, but your progress is good." Camilla listened attentively, her hands still folded but no longer shaking. She finally felt a small sense of reassurance settling in her chest. The medics checked his pulse, his breathing, and his overall condition. Each time they nodded approvingly, Camilla felt another small piece of worry fall away. When they finished, they stepped back and smiled at her. "He is doing well," one of them assured her, "and we will keep monitoring him just to be safe." "Thank you," she replied sincerely. After they left, Thomas quietly stepped inside. He had been waiting outside the door since early morning, ready to assist in any way needed. He bowed his head respectfully. "Good morning, sir. Good morning, ma'am." Charles smiled gently. "Thomas, thank you for yesterday, truly." Thomas straightened, surprised by the personal gratitude. "I only did my duty, sir." Camilla looked at him with sincere appreciation. "You were there at the right moment. For that, we are grateful." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of their gratitude. He had not expected thanks, he simply wanted to help. But hearing those words warmed him deeply. Once Thomas stepped back outside, the room grew quiet again. Charles looked toward the window, watching the sunlight shimmer across the floor. "I suppose the whole palace knows by now," he said with a gentle sigh. Camilla nodded slowly. "Yes, people were very concerned. They saw the medical team rushing through the halls, and they saw me." She paused, embarrassed. "They saw me reacting in a way that must have startled them." Charles turned his head and looked at her with understanding. People often see us as symbols, he said, but we are still human, and sometimes human emotions surprise even ourselves. Camilla smiled faintly. I imagine the staff must still be talking about it. Charles gave a small laugh, quiet and tired, but genuine. Let them talk. What matters most is that you were here. His words softened her heart. She reached for his hand, and he squeezed her fingers gently. Outside the palace, life continued as usual. But inside the private wing, the mood had shifted to something calmer, something almost reflective. The staff moved with renewed determination, wanting to create a peaceful environment for the king's recovery. People spoke quietly about the events of the previous day, but their voices carried compassion rather than gossip. By midday, Charles had regained a bit more strength. He sat up comfortably, supported by pillows, and looked much more alert. Camilla remained near him, reading softly from a book whenever the room grew too quiet. The gentle sound of her voice filled the space with warmth. From time to time, Charles closed his eyes and simply listened. It comforted him more than he expected. The previous day had shaken him too, even if he didn't show it. He was accustomed to carrying responsibilities without complaint, but yesterday reminded him that even he had limits. Camilla paused in her reading and looked at him. Would you like to rest again? Perhaps a little, he replied. She set the book down and watched him quietly for a few moments. The peacefulness of the room, the soft sunlight, the gentle rhythm of his breathing, everything felt calmer now. But outside this calm space, the palace officials were working carefully to manage the situation. They met privately, discussing how to maintain confidentiality while also preparing for any public concern, just in case someone outside the palace learned of the incident. They knew the importance of protecting the king's privacy while also ensuring the palace functioned smoothly. One of the senior advisors spoke with seriousness. What matters most now is his recovery. We must make sure he has the rest he needs. Another nodded. And the queen, she should not carry guilt for her reaction yesterday. She was simply worried. The staff agreed quietly. They respected Camilla more after seeing her raw emotion, not less. It showed them a side of her that was deeply human, deeply caring. Back in the recovery room, as the afternoon light brightened the space, Charles opened his eyes again. Camilla smiled at him gently. I think the worst part is over, she said with hope. I believe so, he replied. For a moment, neither spoke. Instead, they shared a peaceful silence, comfortable and full of understanding. Charles took a slow breath, then said softly, Life reminds us every now and then that we must pause, even when we do not want to. Camilla nodded. Then we will pause, she said firmly. We will take things slowly, and you will recover fully. Her voice carried a determination that steadied him. He smiled. With you by my side, I believe I will. Later in the day, the guard Thomas was given a brief break. As he walked through the courtyard, he thought about the moment he had entered the study, the moment he had seen the queen rush in, and the moment he realized how deeply the royal family cared for one another. He would never forget the quiet strength the king showed even in weakness, nor the way the queen's emotions revealed her heart. By evening, Charles felt noticeably stronger. The medical team was pleased with his progress and assured him that with rest, he would recover well. Camilla finally allowed herself to relax a little more. She sat beside him, talking softly about light topics, giving him comforting stories rather than stressful details. As the day came to an end, the palace grew calm again. The worry from yesterday had softened into relief. Charles rested peacefully. Camilla watched over him gently. The staff moved with quiet respect, grateful that things were improving. The events of the previous day would remain in their memories, not as a frightening tale, but as a reminder of how human moments can touch everyone, even behind palace walls. And though the story would never be spoken publicly, those who witnessed it would remember it as a moment filled not just with fear, but with care, with loyalty, and with the deep, unspoken bond between two people who faced a fragile moment together.